The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as guard Thomas Mitchell took his position at the main entrance. At 52 years old, Thomas had served the royal family for nearly 3 decades. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots polished until they gleamed like mirrors, and his posture remained straight as an arrow despite the early hour. Thomas had seen many changes during his years of service. He had witnessed royal weddings, state visits, and countless ceremonial events. Through it all, he maintained the same professional distance that his training had instilled in him. The royal family were not friends or acquaintances to Thomas. They were his duty, his responsibility to protect and serve. This particular Tuesday morning felt different somehow. Prince George, now 11 years old, had been staying at Windsor with his grandparents, while his parents attended to royal duties abroad. The young prince had always been polite during their brief encounters, offering a simple nod or quiet "good morning" as he passed by with his tutors or protection officers. What Thomas didn't know was that Prince George had been watching him for weeks. The observant young boy had noticed how Thomas never took breaks during his long shifts, how he stood perfectly still even when his leg clearly bothered him, a remnant from his military service before joining the royal protection team. Prince George had asked his grandmother, Queen Camilla, about the guards and their duties. She had explained how dedicated they were, how they put service above comfort, and how important their role was in keeping the family safe. As Thomas stood at his post that morning, he felt a familiar ache in his lower back. The previous night had been particularly difficult. His wife, Margaret, had been in the hospital for 2 weeks, following complications from what should have been routine surgery. The doctors said she was stable but needed more time to recover. Thomas had spent every evening after his shifts at her bedside, catching only a few hours of sleep before returning to duty. The financial strain was beginning to show. Margaret's extended hospital stay meant additional expenses that their modest savings couldn't cover. Thomas had considered requesting overtime shifts, but his supervisor had already assigned him extra duties whenever possible. Pride prevented him from asking for help, and duty prevented him from taking time off when the family needed protection. Prince George emerged from the castle's side entrance, accompanied by his tutor for their morning walk around the grounds. As they approached Thomas's position, the young prince slowed his pace. He had been thinking about something for days, and today felt like the right moment to act. The prince approached Thomas with a confidence that belied his young age. Thomas straightened even more if that was possible, offering a respectful nod as protocol demanded. "Good morning, Thomas," Prince George said, using the guard's first name for the first time. Thomas was surprised. In all his years of service, few royals had addressed him by name during casual encounters. Most simply acknowledged his presence with a nod or brief gesture. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, maintaining his professional tone. Prince George looked up at the tall guard with serious eyes. "Thomas, I know this might sound strange, but I've been watching you. Not in a bad way, but I've noticed things." Thomas remained silent, unsure how to respond to such an unusual conversation. "I know your leg hurts sometimes. I see you shift your weight when you think nobody's looking. And I know you've looked tired lately. My grandmother told me that guards like you have families and lives outside of protecting us." The young prince's words caught Thomas off guard. He had always prided himself on his professional demeanor, never showing weakness or personal concerns while on duty. Prince George continued, "I also know that sometimes people who work for us need help but don't ask because they think it's not proper. Is that true for you, Thomas?" The directness of the question left Thomas momentarily speechless. This 11-year-old boy had seen through his carefully maintained facade with remarkable clarity. "Your Royal Highness, I appreciate your concern, but I assure you that I'm perfectly capable of performing my duties," Thomas managed to say, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. Prince George smiled gently, a wisdom in his expression that seemed far beyond his years. "I didn't ask if you could do your job, Thomas. I asked if you needed help. There's a difference." The simplicity and honesty of the statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. For weeks, he had been struggling alone, maintaining his professional mask while his personal world crumbled around him. The idea that an 11-year-old prince had not only noticed his struggles but was willing to address them directly was overwhelming. "My wife is in the hospital," Thomas found himself saying, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "She's been there for 2 weeks. The doctors say she'll be fine, but it's been difficult." Prince George nodded thoughtfully. "That must be very scary and expensive." The frank acknowledgement of his situation, spoken with such genuine concern, caused something inside Thomas to crack. He had been holding everything together for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply acknowledge his struggles without judgment or pity. "It has been challenging, Your Royal Highness," Thomas admitted quietly. "What's her name?" Prince George asked. "Margaret, sir. We've been married 28 years. "That's a long time," the prince observed. "You must love her very much to have stayed together for so long." Thomas nodded, surprised by the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "She's my everything, sir." Prince George was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Thomas, what if I told you that I have an idea that might help Margaret, and help you too?" The guard looked down at the serious young face staring up at him. "I would listen respectfully to whatever you had to say, Your Royal Highness." "Good," Prince George said with a decisive nod. "But first, I need you to promise me something." "Of course, sir." "Promise me that you'll let me help without arguing about protocol or propriety or any of those grown-up rules that sometimes prevent people from taking care of each other." Thomas hesitated. Every fiber of his training told him that accepting help from a member of the royal family was inappropriate. Yet something in the young prince's earnest expression made him reconsider. "I promise to listen with an open mind, Your Royal Highness," Thomas said carefully. Prince George grinned, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 11-year-old boy he was, rather than a future king. "That's good enough for now. Meet me here tomorrow morning at the same time. And Thomas?" "Yes, sir?" "Tonight, when you visit Margaret, tell her that Prince George sends his best wishes for her recovery." As the prince and his tutor continued their walk, Thomas remained at his post, but his mind was racing. The brief conversation had shaken him more than any crisis or emergency he had faced in his professional career. The genuine concern and unexpected maturity of the young prince had touched something deep inside him that he had been carefully protecting for weeks. For the remainder of his shift, Thomas found himself thinking about the conversation. Prince George had seen through his professional mask with remarkable ease, recognizing not only his physical discomfort, but his emotional struggles as well. The offer of help, delivered with such sincerity and wisdom, had left him feeling both grateful and deeply uncertain about what tomorrow might bring. That evening, as Thomas sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, he shared Prince George's message. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her husband describe the morning's encounter. "That little boy has a good heart," she whispered, squeezing Thomas's hand with what strength she had. "Maybe you should hear what he has to say." As Thomas walked home that night through the quiet streets surrounding Windsor, he couldn't stop thinking about the prince's words. For the first time in weeks, he felt something that had been absent from his life: hope. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions he wasn't sure he was ready to ask, but Prince George's genuine concern had planted a seed of possibility that maybe, just maybe, help was not something to be ashamed of accepting. The castle stood silent and majestic against the night sky, holding within its walls a young prince who was learning that true nobility came not from titles or traditions, but from recognizing the humanity in others and having the courage to act on that recognition. The next morning arrived with unusual bustle around Windsor Castle. Thomas noticed several staff members he didn't recognize moving through the corridors, and there seemed to be more activity than normal in the administrative offices. He took his position at the main entrance, as always, but curiosity gnawed at him as he wondered about Prince George's promised plan. At precisely 9 o'clock, Prince George appeared, but this time he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Mrs. Eleanor Heartfelt, the castle's chief administrative coordinator, a woman Thomas knew by reputation, but had rarely spoken to directly. Behind them followed Dr. Sarah Chen, whom Thomas recognized as one of the royal family's personal physicians. Prince George approached with the same serious expression he had worn the day before. "Good morning, Thomas. I hope Margaret had a better night." "She did, thank you for asking, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, though his eyes kept shifting between the prince and his unusual companions. "I told you I had an idea," Prince George said. "Well, I've spent the last 18 hours making it happen. Mrs. Heartfelt, would you please explain?" Mrs. Heartfelt stepped forward with a warm smile that immediately put Thomas at ease. "Guard Mitchell, Prince George came to me yesterday with a rather unusual request. He wanted to know if there was any provision in the castle's employee benefits for situations like yours." Thomas felt his stomach tighten with embarrassment. "Your Royal Highness, I never intended to burden you with my personal problems." Prince George held up his hand. "You didn't burden me, Thomas. I chose to care. There's a difference. Please let Mrs. Heartfelt finish." Mrs. Heartfelt continued, "What Prince George discovered is that yes, we do have provisions for medical emergencies affecting our staff families, but they're buried in paperwork that most people never see. The fund has been accumulating money for years because so few people know about it." She handed Thomas a folder. "These documents authorize immediate financial assistance for Margaret's medical expenses, both current and ongoing. The fund covers everything that your insurance doesn't." Thomas stared at the papers, unable to process what he was hearing. "I don't understand. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Prince George said gently. "But that's not all. Dr. Chen, would you please?" Dr. Chen stepped forward with her own warm smile. "Guard Mitchell, Prince George asked me to research Margaret's specific condition. I've been in contact with her doctors at the hospital, and I believe I can help." Thomas looked between the three people standing before him, feeling as though he had stepped into some kind of dream. Dr. Chen continued, "Margaret's complications are treatable, but her current medical team is taking a conservative approach that will require several more weeks of hospitalization. With your permission, I'd like to bring in a specialist colleague of mine who has extensive experience with similar cases. We could potentially reduce her hospital stay significantly." "I don't have the money for specialists," Thomas said quietly, the reality of his situation crashing back over him. "The Royal Medical Fund covers all consultation and treatment costs for staff family members in emergency situations," Mrs. Heartfelt explained. "It's part of your employment benefits that you've been paying into for 29 years. Prince George watched Thomas's face carefully as the information sank in. "But here's the most important part, Thomas. None of this is charity. This is what you've earned through your years of service. This is what you deserve as someone who has dedicated his life to protecting my family." Thomas felt his legs go weak. He had been struggling for so long, carrying the weight of Margaret's illness and their financial problems alone, that the sudden removal of that burden left him feeling unsteady. "Your Royal Highness, I don't know what to say," Thomas managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Prince George replied. "But I do need you to do something for me." "Anything, sir?" Prince George's expression became even more serious. "I need you to go to the hospital right now and be with Margaret when Dr. Chen arrives. I need you to hold her hand when the specialist explains how they're going to help her get better." And I need you to stop worrying about money so you can focus on what really matters." Thomas looked down at the young prince, seeing not a member of the royal family, but simply a kind young man who had chosen to care about someone else's suffering. "But, sir, my duty post," Mrs. Hartwell interrupted gently. "Guard Mitchell, you've been assigned to special administrative leave effective immediately. Lieutenant Morrison will cover your duties until you're ready to return." Prince George added, "And before you argue about lost wages, the leave is fully paid." Mrs. Hartwell made sure of that. Thomas felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes. In 30 years of service, he had never experienced anything like this level of care and consideration from anyone, let alone from an 11-year-old prince. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas began, but his voice cracked. Prince George stepped closer. "Thomas, my grandmother taught me that true nobility isn't about titles or crowns. It's about recognizing when someone needs help and having the courage to provide it. You've spent 30 years taking care of my family. Now it's time for my family to take care of you." Unable to contain his emotions any longer, Thomas knelt down to Prince George's level. "Your Royal Highness, your kindness today. I will remember it for the rest of my life." Prince George smiled, and for a moment his young face lit up with genuine joy. "Just help Margaret get better, Thomas. That's all the thanks I need." Dr. Chen handed Thomas her business card. "I'll meet you at the hospital in 1 hour. I've already spoken with Margaret's primary physician and we're going to start the consultation this afternoon." As the small group prepared to disperse, Prince George turned back to Thomas. "Oh, and Thomas, Margaret is going to want to thank me when she's feeling better. Tell her that seeing you smile again is all the thanks I'll ever need." Mrs. Hartwell walked with Thomas toward the castle's exit, explaining practical details about the financial assistance and medical arrangements. But Thomas barely heard her words. His mind was reeling with the magnitude of what had just happened. As they reached the main entrance, Mrs. Hartwell paused. "Guard Mitchell, I hope you understand how extraordinary this morning has been. In my 15 years working here, I've never seen a member of the royal family take such direct personal action to help a staff member." Thomas nodded, still struggling to process the morning's events. "Prince George spent hours yesterday researching every possible way to help you," she continued. "He called me at home last night and insisted that we find solutions immediately. He wouldn't let anyone tell him that bureaucracy or procedures should slow things down." She handed him a final envelope. "These are transportation vouchers, so you don't have to worry about getting back and forth to the hospital. And this," she gave him a small card, "is my direct number. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you call me immediately." As Thomas walked toward his car in the castle parking area, he kept looking back at the entrance where Prince George had delivered news that would change everything. The young prince had already disappeared inside, probably returning to his lessons or other royal duties, but the impact of his kindness would echo through Thomas's life forever. During the drive to the hospital, Thomas called his supervisor to confirm the arrangements Mrs. Hartwell had described. Lieutenant Morrison assured him that everything had been handled properly and that his position would be waiting for him whenever he was ready to return. When Thomas arrived at Margaret's room, she took one look at his face and knew something significant had happened. "The prince?" she asked simply. Thomas sat beside her bed and took her hands in his. "Margaret, I don't know how to explain this, but Prince George has just changed our lives." As he recounted the morning's events, Margaret listened with growing amazement. When he finished, they sat in comfortable silence, both overwhelmed by the generosity and thoughtfulness of an 11-year-old boy who had chosen to see their struggle and act to end it. "Thomas," Margaret said softly, "we've always known the royal family was special, but this is something different. This is a young man who will someday be king, and he's already learned the most important lesson about leadership. What's that? Thomas asked. That true power isn't about commanding others, Margaret replied, smiling through her tears. It's about lifting others up when they can't lift themselves. When Dr. Chen arrived an hour later with her specialist colleague, they brought news that was even better than Thomas had dared hope. Margaret's condition was indeed treatable with a minimally invasive procedure that could be performed the following day. If successful, she could go home by the end of the week. As Thomas held Margaret's hand while the doctors explained the treatment plan, he thought about Prince George's words about focusing on what really mattered. For the first time in weeks, he could do exactly that. The crushing weight of financial worry had been lifted, replaced by hope and gratitude for a young prince who had seen their need and chosen to act with extraordinary kindness. Outside Margaret's hospital room window, Windsor Castle stood majestically in the distance, its towers reaching toward the sky like protective guardians. Somewhere within those walls, Prince George was probably attending to his studies, unaware that his act of kindness had not only saved a family from financial ruin, but had also restored their faith in the basic goodness of human nature. Margaret's surgery was a complete success. By Friday afternoon, she was sitting up in bed, color returning to her cheeks and strength flowing back into her voice. The specialist, Dr. Chen, had brought in performed the procedure with remarkable skill, and Margaret's recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. Thomas spent every moment of his paid leave at Margaret's bedside, marveling at how quickly their world had transformed. The financial stress that had been crushing him for weeks had vanished overnight, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude that seemed to grow stronger each day. On Sunday morning, Margaret was discharged from the hospital. As Thomas helped her into their car, she squeezed his hand tightly. "I need to see him," she said simply. Thomas knew immediately who she meant. "The doctors said you should rest for several days before—" "Thomas," Margaret interrupted gently, "that young man saved our family. I need to thank him properly." The drive to Windsor Castle felt different than it had in years. Instead of approaching his workplace with the weight of personal problems on his shoulders, Thomas felt light, hopeful, and deeply moved by what he had experienced. When they reached the visitors' entrance, Mrs. Hartwell was waiting for them, having arranged a brief meeting at Margaret's request. Prince George appeared in the castle's formal receiving room, dressed casually but carrying himself with the dignified bearing that came naturally to him. When he saw Margaret, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, approaching with a warm smile, "you look much better than I expected." Margaret had planned a formal speech, full of proper protocol and respectful language. But when she saw the young prince's sincere expression, all her carefully chosen words disappeared. "Your Royal Highness," she began, then stopped. "No, that's not right. George," she said, using his name with motherly affection, "what you did for my husband and me, there aren't words for such kindness." Prince George looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. "Mrs. Mitchell, I only did what anyone should do when they see someone who needs help." Margaret smiled, recognizing the same humility and wisdom that had amazed Thomas. "No, dear boy. What you did was extraordinary, but more than that. You did it without being asked, without expecting anything in return, and without hesitation. That's not something anyone would do. That's something very special people do." Thomas watched the interaction with growing emotion. Seeing his wife, healthy and strong again, speaking with the young prince who had made it possible, filled him with a gratitude so profound it almost overwhelmed him. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, "Mrs. Mitchell wanted to thank you personally, but I have something I need to tell you as well." Prince George nodded, giving Thomas his full attention. "Your kindness has changed more than just our financial situation," Thomas began. It has changed how I understand what it means to serve others. For 30 years, I thought service meant standing at attention, following protocols, and maintaining professional distance. Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts. But watching you these past few days, I've learned that true service means seeing when someone is struggling and choosing to act. It means using whatever power or resources you have to lift others up. You've taught me that service isn't about the uniform or the position. It's about the heart. Prince George listened intently, his young face serious but pleased. Which brings me to my decision, Thomas continued. Your Royal Highness, I've spent the last 3 days thinking about how to honor what you've done for my family. I've concluded that the best way I can show my gratitude is to follow your example. Margaret looked at her husband with curiosity, unsure where his words were leading. I'm 52 years old, Thomas said. I've served faithfully for 30 years, and I've been blessed to work for a family that has shown me extraordinary kindness. But I believe it's time for me to serve in a different way. Prince George's expression grew concerned. Thomas, if this is about feeling like you owe me something, it's not about debt, Your Royal Highness, Thomas interrupted gently. It's about purpose. You've shown me that the highest form of service is helping others who need it. I want to spend the rest of my working years doing exactly that. Thomas took a deep breath. I've decided to leave the Royal Protection Service and join the hospital volunteer program where Margaret was treated. They need people to help families navigate financial assistance programs, to provide support during medical crises, and to connect people with resources they don't know exist. The room fell silent as the magnitude of Thomas's decision sank in. Prince George stared at the man who had protected his family for 3 decades, understanding immediately what this choice meant. You're leaving because of what I did? Prince George asked quietly. I'm leaving because of what you taught me, Thomas corrected. Your Royal Highness, you showed me that there are people struggling right now, this very moment, who don't know help exists. You showed me that someone with knowledge and access to resources has a responsibility to bridge that gap. Margaret reached for Thomas's hand, her eyes shining with pride and understanding. Your Royal Highness, Thomas continued, I've spent 30 years protecting your family from external threats. Now I want to spend my remaining working years protecting other families from the kind of internal crisis we just survived. I want to be for someone else what you were for us. Prince George was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had heard. When he spoke, his voice carried a maturity far beyond his years. Thomas, what you're describing, that's exactly what I hoped might happen. The guard looked at him with surprise. When I decided to help you, I wasn't just thinking about solving your immediate problem, Prince George explained. I was hoping that maybe if one person experienced real help when they needed it most, they might remember that feeling and find ways to help others. The young prince walked to the window overlooking the castle grounds. My grandmother taught me that the best leaders don't just solve problems, they inspire others to become problem solvers. If my helping you leads to you helping dozens of other families, then my small act becomes something much bigger. Thomas felt a profound sense of awe at the depth of thought behind Prince George's kindness. This hadn't been a simple gesture of charity, but a carefully considered act designed to create ripples of positive change. Your Royal Highness, Margaret said softly, you understand something that many adults never learn. True generosity isn't just giving help, it's inspiring others to give help. Prince George turned back to them with a smile. Mrs. Mitchell, I learned that from watching people like your husband. Thomas has spent 30 years putting others before himself. I just helped him see that service can take many forms. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward with documents in her hand. Guard Mitchell, Prince George asked me to prepare these yesterday. She handed Thomas a folder. These are your retirement papers, processed with full benefits and pension. There's also a letter of recommendation for the hospital volunteer coordinator and information about a part-time consulting position with the Royal Household Staff Assistance Program. Thomas stared at the papers, overwhelmed once again by Prince George's thoughtfulness and foresight. "You knew I would decide this?" Thomas asked. Prince George grinned, looking for a moment like the 11-year-old boy he was. "I hoped you would, but I wanted to make sure that when you chose to help others, you could do it without worrying about your own family's security." As the meeting came to an end, Thomas and Margaret prepared to leave Windsor Castle for the last time as members of the royal household staff. At the main entrance where Thomas had stood guard for so many years, Prince George walked with them. "Thomas," the prince said as they reached the doorway, "there's something I want you to remember." "Yes, Your Royal Highness?" "What you're doing, leaving a secure position to help others, that takes real courage. That's the kind of courage I hope to have when I'm older." Thomas knelt down to the young prince's level one final time. "Your Royal Highness, you already have that courage. You showed it when you chose to help a struggling guard instead of ignoring his problems. You're going to be an extraordinary king someday." As Thomas and Margaret walked away from Windsor Castle, word of their departure spread quickly through the staff quarters. By evening, an unusual quiet had settled over the palace. Guards who had served alongside Thomas for decades processed the news of his departure and the extraordinary circumstances behind it. In the staff dining hall that night, conversations were subdued and thoughtful. Lieutenant Morrison, who had taken over Thomas's duties, found himself looking differently at his fellow guards and wondering about their personal struggles. Kitchen staff whispered about Prince George's remarkable maturity and kindness. Administrative personnel discussed the employee assistance programs that many had never known existed. The silence that filled the palace wasn't empty or sad. It was the profound quiet that comes when people are forced to reconsider their assumptions about service, leadership, and human kindness. Prince George's act had created ripples that touched everyone who heard the story. 3 weeks later, Thomas began his new position at the hospital. On his first day, he helped a young father navigate the financial assistance application process, potentially saving the man's family from bankruptcy during their child's cancer treatment. As Thomas guided the grateful father through the paperwork, he thought about Prince George and smiled. The young prince's kindness had indeed created something much bigger than solving one family's crisis. It had inspired a dedicated protector to become a dedicated helper, ensuring that many more families would receive the assistance they needed during their darkest hours. Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, Prince George continued his studies and royal duties, unaware that his act of kindness had become a quiet legend among the staff. But sometimes, walking past the entrance where Thomas used to stand, he would smile, knowing that somewhere in the world, a good man was following his example by choosing to help others in their time of need. The guard had departed out of honor, not the formal honor of military protocol, but the deeper honor that comes from recognizing a profound example of leadership and choosing to follow it by serving others with the same spirit of generous kindness that had once saved his own family from despair.